Well, good afternoon, everybody. I apologize for getting this out late. This is the Strengths and Weaknesses lecture for student success class. I apologize again for getting this out late. Unfortunately, my wife, my daughter, and I have all come down with the coronavirus. So we are just getting over that. You may hear a little bit of a frog in my throat, but we are all doing good. Everything is doing all right. We're through the worst of it at this point. So I would appreciate you guys kind of bearing with me with the voice and situation. So there you go. As I mentioned before, we are on the strengths and weaknesses portion of student success class, and this is an interesting assignment that I hope you guys got a little bit of value out of. So we'll just dive right in, I guess. And, the interesting thing and the reason why I set this assignment in the first place is because I think that there's a tremendous amount of value that you can get from understanding your strengths and your weaknesses in life. Not just because you might be asked that question in an interview at some point, but because it really gives you a lot of value. And quite frankly, I know too many people in life who it is just a shock to them when asked the question, what are you good at, what are you bad at, or even just, when it comes up casually in your life, that people have I notice that many folks have a terrible understanding of what they're good at and a terrible understanding of what they're bad at. And so I think that the value in understanding this is, can just really take you far throughout your ministry, through your career, through your relationship with your friends, your spouse, the people who are in authority over you, whether that's your boss or that's your parents or that's your your pastor, what have you. Understanding the things that you are good at and understanding the things that you really are not good at can help you and take you so far in your life. The reason why I believe that is because the idea, we've had a couple of folks who commented on the feed and they talked about, you need to work on your weaknesses. You're going to need to kind of, do your best at your strengths and things like that. Well, what's interesting is the more that you know about yourself and the more that you understand, how you can improve and the things that you can do better and the things that you do really well already. And the more that will help you throughout your life, because then you can take time to not only, work on your weaknesses to the point where they're not as much of a detriment, but it can also help you because if you really understand where you're not good, you can surround yourself with people who are good in that area. Perhaps a spouse, perhaps somebody at work, perhaps somebody in your ministry relationship. Understanding the things that you really aren't good at can help you so much because the things that you aren't good at and the things that you don't like are oftentimes something that somebody else really does like. This is actually a really interesting thought for me because when my wife and I were talking through different responsibilities when we first got married, you kind of go through this phase of understanding, okay, who's going to do this chore and who's going to do that chore. And, it's interesting because the things that we aren't necessarily very good at, one of the things that I really hate doing is dishes. For some reason, I absolutely hate it. It's not necessarily a weakness per se, but I hate doing dishes. And what was interesting to me is when having this conversation, my wife actually really enjoyed doing the dishes, but she hated other aspects of things about the housework that I actually really enjoyed. And you find that very similar concept with your strengths and weaknesses. If you talk to me about doing something like compliance work, where you are essentially just making sure that people are doing, checking a box and making sure that this 20-point checklist is all finished up and wrapped up, and so that we can get all of our stuff organized in a nice little perfect area. That's not me. That's not something that I'm good at. But what's interesting is as much as I absolutely hate doing compliance work, there are other people that I have met who love doing compliance work and are more than happy to do it. And I think it's a failure of many of us, myself included, to think that, just because I'm not particularly good in this particular area or a set of areas means that everyone else must hate it, which is interesting because it's not the case. And so, my thought with this is just that when you understand the things that you're good at, you can take extra time. In fact, I think that there was a video that I showed, or that I had on this, that talks about you taking extra time for the things of your strengths. Because if you are already gifted or talented at something, the chances of you becoming excellent and in the top, say, 5% of people in that particular thing is greater than you taking something that you're horrible at already and then getting to somewhere that's at the 95th percentile for you, something that you're not talented at. The chances of you becoming excellent in that thing are nothing. Now, I think I mentioned to one of you guys in this feed that yes, absolutely, if there's a glaring a glaring weakness, like you're an extremely unpleasant person and people just don't like being around you, well, you obviously should take some time and work on that particular thing so that it's, to the point where people aren't just frustrated being around you continually, but that there's a point at which you should stop working on the things that you really just aren't good at in general and start focusing on the things that you have that are strengths that you can be, in the top 5 or 1% at in your life. And so, it's interesting because I just realize going through life how much that this can serve you or can be to your detriment. I think that one of the things that we do culturally that is both a positive and negative is that we encourage people, and we talk about, this generation being, snowflakes who get a trophy for everything, or, whatever it is. And, I disagree in general with the idea of everybody gets a trophy, because I think that you instilling false confidence in somebody is ultimately over the long term actually not going to help them. And you can see that through a number of different areas. But I think it is important and good in the sense of, that what we've done is we've taken a really good concept that, you should instill self-worth into people and you should instill confidence into people. And that's kind of where this idea of everybody gets a trophy that, I'm going to harp on that. It's kind of it's low hanging fruit, in my opinion, but saying everybody gets a trophy is good in the sense that, you want to instill self-worth into people. You want to instill confidence in people, but negative in the sense of instilling false confidence and false self-worth into people is going to hurt you over the long term so much more. And I think that the middle ground that I would advocate for as a part of this lecture and as a part of this classroom is that we need to instill confidence and self-worth in the things that people are really good at. And that's why where this class comes in is you need to understand where you're really good and where you're really bad. And then you need to be able to look and see that in other people, because you and I have a tremendous impact on people that we come into contact with to say, wow, you're really good at that. That's something that you are very gifted at. And, if somebody is not necessarily very good at that, that you don't compliment those things. It's not that you go around telling people that they suck at something. It's that you say, no, we're going to focus our effort and our attention onto the things that people thrive at. And I think that we've all been able to see the converse of this. I share a story about this, or a few of them actually, but it's like, any worship leader will talk to you about people's gift sets, and how every worship leader that I think I've ever interacted with has always talked to me at some point about somebody who told them that they had a gift for singing and that God had called them to sing and that they were excellent and that they wanted to be the worship leader. And then the worship leader talked to them and said, okay, let's hear you sing. And they could not carry a tune to save their lives, right? That they were just, this was something that they were clearly that God had not gifted them in. And they were insistent that this was something that they wanted to spend their life and their passion towards. And perhaps some of you guys know someone like that who really thinks that they have a talent for music, and that they absolutely have no ability to carry a tune. They're off key, and it's just like, nails on a chalkboard type of a sound. Perhaps not that bad, but you understand the idea. And I get that time and time again. And the reason why is because we're instilling a false confidence in somebody like that is ultimately over the long term going to really hurt them because of our inability to be honest with them to start out, right? an example that I'll share with you is somebody that I actually went to high school with. And this gal was extremely good with people. She was very personable, and she was just excellent, kind of the popular girl that everyone wanted to be around. It was a very bubbly personality. But she talked to me about, when we were wrapping up our high school, we were about to graduate, and she said something like, well, I think I'm going to be a physician's assistant. And that which is just a tier, just barely step below a doctor, which requires tons of math and science. I mean, you have to be extremely gifted in math and science to do this. And so one of the things that gal talked about was that she really, really wanted to do this, and that she felt like that's what she wanted to do, and that she was going to spend all of her time really studying to do that. And my first question to her was, hey, so do you like math and science? And she said, no, I hate math and science. And I said, well, doesn't being a physician's assistant require that you take a lot of math and science courses? She said, well, but I really want to take care of people, and I want to help them. And, I really like medicine, the idea of medicine. She may have watched some doctor shows on TV or something like that, where she got this in her head that she was going to do this and she was going to be really good at it. And one of the things I talked to her about gently was saying, okay, well, maybe you should think about this, because I had graded this individual's papers and knew that they were not strong in math and science. In fact, very poor at it. And so I, kind of tried to gently talk this person through, and I really didn't have the relationship to really kind of level with them and say, no, you really shouldn't do this. But there were other people in her life who were encouraging her to go into that, because she said she had a passion for it. And what was interesting was that after 2 years, I went to that same person, ran into him, and I talked to him, and I said, how did it go with doing your prereqs for this physician's assistant program, or nurse practitioner or something like that? And she said, it was horrible. I absolutely hated it. Kyle, I couldn't stand it. And I said, why? What happened? You were so passionate about this thing. She said, well, I really like the care for people and interacting with the people and being able to help them, but I could not handle the math and science, and it was making me miserable. And what's interesting is if somebody had just leveled with her, somebody close to her who had a good amount of rapport with her, had said, look, this is not somewhere that you're going to excel. Maybe some other path where you can have just as much of an impact on the lives of people would be a good option that doesn't require the math and science, because quite frankly, that's not your strong suit. And so rather than having a difficult conversation with this person, what we did was we said, oh, okay, we're going to let you waste 2 years and tons of money, and you're going to get to the same point that you would be as if somebody had just a difficult conversation with you and said, hey, this isn't your gift set. This isn't what you're good at. And so I think it's interesting, and my challenge, my encouragement to you guys is to really just take this to heart and look at your own life and say, okay, where am I just really honestly trying to, hitting my head against the wall, trying to be good at something that realistically I'm just not. And is there anything in your life that you can look at and you can say, man, I'm really just not good at that. Man, I'm really just not. I'm trying to be good at something that I'm just not. This isn't how I'm built. This isn't how I'm gifted. And to be able to say, oh, and it's honestly very freeing for you to say, wow, I'm not good at that. Maybe I should take some time and work on the things that I'm really good at, so that I can have a real honest and good sense of confidence in something that I'm doing. And so what I find interesting too is, and one of the ways that you can really honestly look at your skill set in your life and whether or not you're necessarily great or bad at something is how you've been perceived in the past, and how that's not how you've been perceived in the past. That's not a good way. The results that you've been getting in the past from trying something. So I'll give you an example. I heard this actually really interesting comment by a comedian of all people. He talks about it in his comedy bit, and he said something that has stuck with me for a really long time that I think applies to these strengths and weaknesses. And it's this: if you encounter the same issue everywhere, you're the issue. Or another way, if you encounter the same problem everywhere, you're the problem. If you encounter the same issue with trying to do something that you're really not good at all the time, maybe the result isn't that it's the environment, it's the manager, the whoever. Maybe the problem is that that's not where you're gifted. And I think that that's interesting to be able to look at your own life and say, wow, I get the same result everywhere, or people perceive me the same way everywhere, and I think it's so incorrect. Man, maybe it's me. I actually had an interesting story to kind of share, an embarrassing one with you guys, is that I was actually sitting around, I kind of noticed that, this is a little embarrassing to share, but I don't have a great first impression with people, and I would notice that it really, honestly, over time, I would do really well with people. That if I got the chance to spend 6-12 months with somebody, it seemed like most people really enjoyed me. Granted, there's obviously some exceptions, but most people really enjoyed being around me, and that I could pretty much become friends with anybody if you gave me 6 to 12 months. But it was that 1 month to 6 months that I really struggled with making, relationships and having people respond positively to me. And so it was interesting. This kind of really came to a head when I had a conversation at a church that I was attending, and I had a conversation with a gal, and we were, in a big group at, I think it was, like a sushi restaurant, and she said, hey, let's play this game called First Impressions. What was your first impression of me? And so we played this first impression of game, and we all ran around the story, and told stories about our first impression of each person around the table. And I will never forget when 2 or 3 different people looked at me. They said, I thought you were a total jerk. I thought you were a total jerk when I first met you. And then one of the girls actually said, when I met you first, I thought you were a pompous a-hole. And she actually said it in the middle of this church group. And it took me aback, because I go, well, why did you think that? And she said, and she gave examples of, a couple of behaviors that I was exhibiting, and the fact that I wasn't really smiling at people, or I wasn't, whatever it was. And there was a couple of people who said, yeah, I actually noticed that about you when they first met. And I went, I don't do that. Your first reaction is to kind of get defensive. And so I was like, man, I kind of hurt a little bit, and my first reaction, of course, is to say, well, I don't do that. And then I thought about it, and I said, well, I'm getting this result, and I'm noticing this kind of a similar trend around multiple people. What do I need to do to be able to change this perception and create a good relationship with people from day one? And so it was a really good learning experience for me to be able to say, oh, okay. And then I went to actually somebody that I worked with who told me, I said, hey, what were your first impressions of me? Because I was curious. And she said, I hated you initially. And I said, why? And she said, well, every morning when you come into work, you never said good morning to me. You never smiled. You just walked through straight past me, walked into your office, and then we got started with the day. And it took me about 6 months to realize that had nothing to do with me, and that you didn't like me. It was just you just didn't realize that was a problem. And then her talking to me about that went, I didn't even, for some reason, I hadn't realized it. And so from that day forward, it's been, kind of one of those things where I've been able to slowly kind of work on it, and it's gotten better over time. And so I would just encourage you to look at certain areas in your own life and say, wow, where am I getting a really negative result that a lot of people are having the same, perception of me? And is it possible? And I would say it's most likely probable that, am I the issue? And so hopefully that can serve you over the long term. Again, that's helped me and hurt me in my career for knowing what my strengths were and not understanding what my weaknesses were. So that will help you guys over the long term in your career. Hopefully this exercise helped you. Hopefully you got some people who are honest, brutally honest with you about some things that you're good at and bad at, so that you can cut out the things in the areas that you're able to cut out some of those weaknesses and amplify those strengths. Another thing that I'd like you guys to notice, and I'll say this in way of closing, is just that your strengths and weaknesses, it's interesting, are often very closely correlated. And one of the things that I use as an example from my own life is that at almost every job that I've gotten, they've told me something that, like, they'd say, you're kind of a pusher. And they actually, it's interesting because 3 different people at 3 different companies, in different time frames of my life, probably across 7 or 8 years, have told me you're a pusher. And what's interesting is I noticed that about myself, and it can be really negative in certain connotations and certain circumstances, right? That me being, they say, if you notice a problem, you really just can't let it go. You have to address it. And sometimes it gets to a point where it's one of those things that you just need to leave alone. And that's the negative. Now, I actually got a job where me being a pusher and me being a hard driving individual actually served me really well in my career. And so I got a job where that was actually, not only was it a strength for me, but it was encouraged for other people, for you to say, no, let's try to get this done, and continually push and push and push. And one of the other areas that this actually really helps is in my marriage. Now, sometimes me being, pushing and pushing with my wife doesn't help, and there's certain areas where that doesn't help at all. But there are a lot of areas that really helps us, because in my marriage, if I notice that there's a problem, or if I notice that something isn't right between me and my wife, I will push and push and push and push to be able to try to fix it and to try to move forward and be in a good spot with my wife. And that's something that really has helped our marriage in a lot of cases. Now, granted, there's some negatives that I have to work on about that particular aspect of my personality, but in a lot of cases it's actually helped us. And so what I can hopefully encourage you guys with is just that, look at the areas and the things that you're good at, and look at particular spots where that can be good, and then look at spots where that can be bad, and say, okay, how can I try to hedge against some of these negative things while amplifying the positives as much as possible? And am I in a spot where the negatives about the things that I'm really good at, the negatives of those are those being, am I constantly experiencing the negatives of those traits in myself at where I work, at where I'm serving in ministry or what have you, and say, okay, maybe I need to make a shift. Maybe that's a new job. Maybe that's a different area of the ministry and things like that, right? It would be inappropriate for me, particularly when I was getting so much feedback about how I didn't make a good first impression. It's a really bad idea for me to be on the greeting team. If I'm terrible at that, it's not a great idea. But there are other areas that I would be well suited to in a ministry that say, okay, this kind of helps your personality, and this is an area where you can get to know people over time and be able to serve and interact with people over a longer period of time to be able to hedge against some of that negative about you. And so it's interesting, and I hope that you guys are able to take that into your next steps in your life and in your career, hopefully into the rest of this time at Gather for Him. So again, if you guys have any questions, if you have any thoughts, anything like that, feel free to share it with me. You have my contact information, but we'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.